to reply on behalf of the Staines family. So the next speaker graduated from University College Dublin with an honours BCL in 1973 and an honours master's degree in law in 1975. In between, he qualified as a solicitor in 1974. He obtained a postgraduate diploma, having a thesis published on an aspect of Irish constitutional law and the European Union Treaty. He set up Michael J. Staines and Company in 1985 and has written many legal articles and lectured extensively on criminal law. He has appeared as an advocate in all levels of court, from the District Court, Children's Court, all the way up to the Supreme Court, and he was the chair of the Criminal Law Committee. In September 2020, he was granted a patent of precedence to use the title of Senior Counsel. To reply on behalf of the Staines family, would you please welcome Michael Staines?
Thank you, Tony. What a beautiful day and what a beautiful, beautiful town. And I have to say that I'm very privileged to be here. I'm very privileged that I'm here representing my family and that I'm also here representing Michael Staines. And I just want to say, first of all, I'd like to thank a few people, and I'll make this quite short, but when myself and my two sisters started thinking about this whole idea, we didn't know where to go, and we happened to come upon a Peter Mullaney, who was here, and he was absolutely kind to us and introduced us to two other people, that's Martin Delan and Cormac Kelly. And between the three of them, they pushed us and said, we have to do this, of course you must do this, Newport would love you to do this. And other people in Newport said the same thing to us. So we felt from the very beginning that we had the support of the people from Newport. And then, of course, the Garda Síochána themselves indicated that they were anxious to get involved in such a celebration. And I'd like to thank Chief Superintendent Ray McMahon, Superintendent Joe McKenna, Sergeant Peter Hanley, who did a huge amount of work in this, and all of their team. And then finally, in relation to the Guards, I would like to thank the Commissioner himself, who's been very supportive, and AC Mick Finn, who was very supportive as well. Three other people from the Guards I'd like to mention. We've already heard Dr. Reynolds. Now the difficulty with that man is he's taken most of my best lines, so my speech is going to be much shorter than it, but maybe that's a good thing that was going to be. I see Superintendent Paul Smith has written a book about my grandfather is here, and I'd also like to pay a word of respect to Sergeant Greg Allen, R.I.P. He died many years ago, but he was the man instrumental in trying to get the history of the Garda together, and he set up the Garda Museum, and I think everybody owes him a debt of gratitude. And of course, as I said already, my two sisters, Mary and Catherine, and of course Andy Warren, my brother-in-law, who was the man who organised this. I think it's fantastic, and I'd just like to thank Andy very, very much for all the work he did on it. So I'll try to be quite short. I'd just like to give you some kind of view as to what Michael's, who he was and what he was. As I said already, he was born here in Kiltarnet to a woman who came from here, and his father was an RIC man, and they moved to Roscommon, and then they moved up to Dublin. And they obviously were a very Republican and nationalistic family. I'd imagine that's because of Margaret, who comes from here. But in fact, four of his brothers were very heavily involved in the movement for freedom, including one of them who was badly injured in the Mendicity in 1916. And another one worked on a ship that travelled from New York to London and spent most of his time smuggling in guns when he could. And three others, but the one that might interest most of you, or at least the women here, is that his sister May, when Michael was actually in custody in Mountjoy, spent her time visiting him, but at the same time bringing in guns to help the escape of General McKeown, and she brought in apparently 23 revolvers into Mountjoy at different times. So they were obviously a very Republican family, and when Michael went up to Dublin, he joined the Cunna na Gaeilge, and then he was a founder member of the Volunteers in 1915, and in fact, interestingly enough, the year later, that was in Rotunda, and the year later he was the officer in charge of security for the first annual meeting of the Volunteers, which was in the Abbey Theatre. And in his job, he was obviously a stubborn man, like some other members of my family, I think, and he wouldn't let Pádraig Pearse into the meeting because Pádraig Pearse hadn't got his ticket. And it was only when the O'Rahilly, another famous man, said, well, Michael, you have to let that man in, he's our leader, basically, that he let him in. And then some weeks later, he was appointed Commissioner, Quartermaster General of the Volunteers. What had happened was that the previous Quartermaster General, the O'Rahilly, had said he was not going to get involved in the rebellion, and Michael was made to be Quartermaster General and spent his time getting guns and so on and so forth for the rebellion. And then, in fact, another interesting thing was, because because the rebellion was cancelled on the Sunday, and because the person in charge had indicated that the rebellion was not to go on, Pearse and McDermott had to go to my grandfather, who was captain of the Dublin Brigade of the volunteers, asking his permission for the rebellion to commence. And it was, I'm sure he had no choice but to say yes, but he did say yes. And on the Monday morning, he found himself down in Liberty Hall with Pearse and Connolly and others, and he had organised some taxis, and in particular he'd organised a horse and cart to carry the munitions and artillery and so on up to the GPO. And one interesting story is, as they were going up to Abbey Street, the horse kind of slipped and the wagon kind of bounced around, and I think everybody said this is the end of the Easter Rebellion, which hadn't yet started. When he went into the GPO, then another interesting aspect of him was that as he walked up the steps, some lady who was working in the GPO said, "Ah, Michal, there you are. That's the stuff to give those fellas." And on he went upstairs to deal with I think there was soldiers upstairs. So in the GPO, he was obviously still Quartermaster General. He was involved. He found, in fact, Connolly, who was injured, and in fact he was. There's a famous picture of Connolly in a stretcher, and my grandfather and other people around him. And he also was the officer in charge of the stretching bearing party that brought Connolly up O'Connell Street and up to Parnell Square. And there's a famous picture of that where they meet the British military, and they were in fact arrested. And my grandfather, being the type of man he was, said, "But we're here under a flag of truce." But that made no difference at the time, and he was brought into Ship Street, which is Dublin Castle. And there he met McDermott again, who was a very good friend of his. And McDermott went over to him and took his Sam Brown belt, the officer's belt, off him and said, "Michael, I'll hold on to that. You don't need that anymore. We will need you in the future," which I always felt was a very nice recommendation from a man who was executed some days later. He was then in Kilmainham and was there at the time of the executions and would have spoken to Plunkett and a couple of other of the men who were executed. Thereafter, he was sent over to Frongoch. Frongoch was an internment camp in Wales where the British in their wisdom decided that they would put all the people who were involved in the rebellion in 1916, thus creating in effect a university for all of those, and most of the people who were there would have ended up fighting in the War of Independence. And my grandfather was appointed the commandant of all of those people. And you've heard what Mr. Brendan Whitmore said about him, but interesting for us, because there's some lawyers in the family, he spent a lot of his time engaged in correspondence with the authorities, legal correspondence with the authorities, fighting on behalf of the men in relation to the British wanted the men to identify themselves so that they could be conscripted into the British Army to fight in Europe. And there was war. He resisted all of that. But there, interestingly enough, he obviously knew Collins, because Collins was in the GPO in 1916, or at least was in 1916, but Collins was formed in fact in Frongoch. And then when they left, my grandfather remained very friendly with Collins, and in fact, in my view, I think he was kind of a right-hand man of Collins. He seems to have done a lot of things at Collins' request. So he came back, helped reorganise the volunteers, Quartermaster General again. He was involved, as you said there, John, in relation to the Republican Police. He was involved. He was the chairman of the Belfast boycott, and so on. He was elected an MP, and then later a TD, and he took part in the first Dáil. And then he was. He was somebody who the British were interested in, and in fact was on the British wanted list, and escaped on several occasions arrest. But eventually he was arrested at a meeting of the City Hall, and he was incarcerated in Mountjoy, where again he was elected leader of the prisoners there, even though people like Arthur Griffith were prisoners there at that stage. So again, I think that was an honour for him. He then eventually was asked, as John has explained so well, to become Commissioner of the Civic Guard, as it was later called the Garda Síochána. And I think John has set out very well all of the things that he did and tried to do. And I'm very proud of all of that. And two things that I'm very proud about is, or at least I often think about, is the fact that he was aware there was trouble at Mill, as we say, in Kildare. He knew that there was a lot of guards in Kildare who were disaffected, and he had to drive down to Kildare to speak to him. And he stood there like the way I'm standing here in front of over 1,000 men, many of whom are armed. And I would imagine he didn't know whether he was going to be shot or not, because there was every chance that he would be. And I think that was an extraordinary brave thing for somebody to do. And I often think of my grandmother, who he was now engaged to, and what she must have felt knowing that could happen. And the second thing I'm very proud of is, as John said, and as Tony said, as everybody has said, the fact that he led the first group of Irish service people into the GPO, to take over the GPO, which was the bastion of British rule for 700 years. So, So I'm so proud of that, and I'm so delighted that there's going to be a special commemoration of that next week. So to finish up, because I know I'm going on a bit long, I just 3 little thoughts about him. I think his legacy. Where's his legacy? Well, you don't have to look very far. His legacy is all around you. The Garda Síochána, as I said, they've had their ups and downs, but they have been a huge positive force in this country, and have ensured that this country has remained a democratic country, and has remained a democratic country governed by the rule of law. And I think my grandfather would be very proud to look around and see what is here. The second point is the famous words that John has mentioned. A very difficult benchmark for both the Garda Síochána and the Commissioner, that they have to, that's something that they have to try to comply with. But it's not only the guards, it's the police forces of other countries. I've been visiting police forces of other countries in relation to my work as a solicitor, and these words have often been said back to me. So it is something that people do say, you know, the moral force of the people is so important. And the final thing is a very personal thing, because like anybody who's had people involved in any type of troubles like that, people don't talk about them. And my grandfather never talked about this at home, and none of his sons or daughters ever knew anything much about what happened. The odd couple of things slipped out from here and there, but my father mentioned to me that after my grandfather had died, my father, Lord Mercy, was walking across O'Connell Bridge, and he met a very well-known Fianna Fáil politician who I shall not name, and he stopped him and talked to my father, and obviously recognised him, and said, look, your father was a very straight man, an honest man, he was a trusted man, and he did his utmost to try to avoid the trouble and the civil war. And I think that that's a lovely, fine epitaph for my grandfather. So I'd like to thank you all again, and I'm so happy to be here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. Said with all sincerity, I noted that you didn't have any notes. Well done.